First, I couldn't be more pleased that you will be the 9th director of Berkeley Lab. So what are you thinking about as you come to this job?
Well, thanks very much. And I'd say it's just an incredible honor and a huge responsibility. This lab has been really important to me personally in my own research. It's allowed me to work on cross-disciplinary teams, in some cases to lead those teams, and to really have impact far beyond my own research expertise. And I think that's one of the things that makes the lab really special. On the responsibility side, what I think about is the talent, the people that are here, and as well as the facilities. But I think in terms of the people at the lab, all the expertise they bring, but also their commitment to the mission of the lab. And I will say over the last 6 years, as I've been spent more of my time on the campus, whenever I see one of the buses come by that says Science Solutions for the World, it always just gives me a warm feeling of, that's what the lab does. So
that's what it does for me too. So you've been in a range of leadership roles, both here at the laboratory and also on campus. What was it like for you to make the transition from being a faculty member and a researcher to actually doing these leadership roles?
Yeah, well, I can't say it was planned or expected. I'll just say, growing up, I always loved math and science. And so the idea that I would go into this kind of, technical field was, I think, something that I was very much looked forward to. But I really didn't have an understanding of what it meant to do research. Growing up, it was not in the culture of my family. There was, I would say, what I got from my family, though, was a commitment to doing something that you love. I feel incredibly lucky to be able to do research, that somebody pays me to think about these important problems and really to try to make advances in the field, even as an individual researcher. And now I feel lucky to try to have impact in a different way across a whole set of researchers across the lab. And so that notion of kind of what it means to have impact is something that I also really developed here in my own department on campus, that we value when we look at promotion and tenure cases, really think very broadly about what it means to have impact in my discipline of computer science or electrical engineering and computer science. And so I think that right now when I am in these kinds of leadership roles, it's really a question of how do I maximize the impact.
So some people at the lab know you from your previous job, but a lot of people don't. So for them, how would you describe your leadership style?
Well, first I would say I love being a member of a team, and I also like to lead teams. And so I consider myself to be a really consultative leader. So I absolutely understand that I have to make decisions. And I would say in the last couple of years as Vice Chancellor for Research at Berkeley, the need to make sometimes very difficult decisions comes up over and over again. So I feel comfortable having to do that, but I really like to hear the views of experts on whatever topic is coming up. And I like to also hear conflicting views and those that might be in contrast to my own impressions of what I want to do. So I just think it helps me to make better decisions.
So how do you see the responsibilities of a lab director as different from, say, an LD or Vice Chancellor research, your last couple of jobs?
Well, of course, the scale of the lab director is really quite different than an associate lab director, where you're working on at least it may be a broad research area, but you're working on that. And it was my own, as an ALD, I was in charge of computing sciences, so I felt very comfortable with the research that I was talking about or the user facilities that I was overseeing. Although I have to say, even as NERSC director, one of the first things that I learned was I had to be able to talk to the NERSC users about science in many different disciplines, and often we talk about science highlights in everything from particle physics to biology, and that gave me some experience being able to think about and talk about and appreciate the contributions of a lot of different science disciplines. I think the contrast looking over the research areas at Berkeley as Vice Chancellor for Research, which are even broader than here at the lab. But I think you said this, and I took it to heart, which is that's an administrator role, and this is a leadership role and a manager role, and those are quite different. And my ability to steer the research agenda on the campus is quite limited, other than some seed funding programs, trying to inspire people maybe to work in a particular area. But it's really much more about running the kind of machinery behind research that allows the research to happen.
So we're in a time at the laboratory of rapid change, and in fact, in the scientific enterprise across the country. So how does that inform what you think of as you come into this job?
Well, I think that, we've gone through a number of changes in the past. We've gone through changes in priorities. We've gone through changes because of technology. I think what is really different right now, as you said, is the speed with which that change is happening. And it makes it very difficult for people to adapt sometimes, to figure out how they're going to align their work or take on, use some new technology such as AI in the research that they're doing. And it frankly can be very threatening to people, I think, to even think about this artificial intelligence stuff, and is it going to ruin my field of research? So that, I think, all of those things just mean that it is a very challenging time for researchers, and but there's also enormous opportunities. And that's the way I think about it is, if you're going to be successful in a time of rapid change, you've got to be able to adapt and to take advantage of the opportunities that exist, and they do exist across many areas. And I think one of the things I think about is how we need to look at talent that we're hiring and bringing to the lab at the junior level or at the senior level, for example, in a leadership team. And that people we have to look for people who are going to be able to adapt and to want to explore new opportunities and new areas. Because the truth is, over a research career, your research may change or may need to change for many different reasons. You may get scooped, you may have you run into a dead end. A lot of different things happen. Those tend to happen much more gradually, right? That you maybe being scooped can be quite sudden, but you normally see that the approach you're taking is not going to be workable because somebody else is out competing you, or because it's just not going to get you to the solution, and you can change more slowly. But now I think we really do need to help people figure out how to really quickly look at how they adapt to the changing kind of environment.
So what are the new priorities you're thinking about, and also what are the continuing priorities of the laboratory?
Well, I think that my top priority, given the situation at DOE and what I think is a very exciting mission, the Genesis mission, is for this lab to be the leading lab at delivering scientific capabilities, scientific impact with AI. And that is very carefully chosen, as opposed to the biggest machine or the biggest model or something else. It's like, how do we maximize scientific impact in using AI? And so I think we need to think very carefully about what are the most efficient methods to use, what is the most efficient way to use the machines, what is the best data that we have, and how do we use that in order to train models in order to have scientific impact. The other thing is the core of this laboratory's excellence. If you look at many of the awards that we've won, and a lot of the kinds of impact really go back to fundamental science. And I think it's very important that this laboratory continues to deliver and advance breakthroughs in fundamental science. I think of this as the innovation and technology for our grandchildren, but also where science will be for the future generations at a different point than it is today. So we need to continue to advance all those disciplines of science. Beyond that, I think continuing the outstanding operations of our user facilities. This lab has more user facilities than any other lab. It affects more users. It has just an enormous impact on the broad research community around the world, but certainly across this laboratory, across the state, and across the nation. And so being able to complete, for example, the upgrade of the advanced light source is very important to me. But I think for each of our user facilities, as some things become commoditized, for example, genome sequencing or cloud computing or access to microscopes in maybe a future laboratory that's in the cloud or some things like that, we need to think about how this lab's user facilities can up their game and provide something that is really a unique capability for the scientists. And so really thinking about the sort of future of each one of our laboratories and how they continue to provide unique services. And then I think beyond that is on the operations side of things is to maintain the kind of excellence and stewardship across the lab that you have really instilled in people.
So what research opportunities at the lab do you find really exciting right now?
Well, I think, in all of the different science disciplines across the lab, there is an opportunity to use AI. And how do we use AI in data analysis? How do we find smaller and smaller signals and noisier data? And I think that is true whether we're looking at cosmology or microbiology. I think another area that we're looking at, of course, is automation of labs. That is for the experimentalists at the lab. And as somebody who worked here at the lab in computing, when computing really meant modeling and simulation, there was a huge swath of the lab that really didn't think they had much to do with computing because they were experimentalists. Of course, their data sets started getting larger and they were looking for places to analyze them and store them. But I think that the automation of some of those experiments is also going to be a really exciting area. And I think there's just going to be opportunities that we don't even envision right now, and how these models are going to be used for other kinds of scientific problems really across the complex. I'm also just very excited about the science itself, and learning about things like the measurements from the DESI experiment, and really trying to get a better understanding of dark energy, and is it really something much more complicated than I think the current models will reflect, understanding things about microbes in the environment, biology of proteins, and really, and how can we also control these things? How can we control the environment through gene editing or through other kinds of mechanisms? So I think there's just a lot to be done there. And I guess sort of another area that I think is really important to this laboratory, and is the one where AI is already seeing a lot of uptake, is in design. So design of proteins, but also design of chemicals, design of materials, and how can we speed up that process of inverse design when we are looking for a particular material, whether it's for a battery or for some other kind of environment that we're trying to build something for. Can we use AI to accelerate the process of discovering and then maybe even testing that material?
So as you know, I've spent a lot of time on developing and talking about the culture of stewardship at the laboratory, and I've really been pleased at how well it's been adopted all over the laboratory. But these things change with time. Culture is always evolving. So how do you think about that as you come in?
Well, let me first say that I've just been so impressed at how you have really impacted the culture of the lab, and I saw that working with you as ALD. But then even on the campus, and seeing the kinds of communications that come out from you about sometimes very challenging topics, very stressful topics, but I think that it shows a sense of empathy for all the people at the lab, and also shows a very clear kind of focus on the mission and how we think about stewardship of the lab in alignment with that mission, and that can help then make decisions, and even in decisions that can be very difficult. But when you think about really what is the overarching mission and what is in the best interest of the laboratory as a whole.
So our extraordinary research here is really enabled by our terrific operations here at the laboratory. So how will you work with Michael Brandt to improve and keep that great operation performance?
Well, I had an opportunity to work with Michael a little bit when I was still here at the lab as Associate Laboratory Director. And I think that even in my job now as Vice Chancellor of Research, it's somewhat unusual, at least across the UC system, that I oversee environment, health, and safety. And so what I think about when I talk with the people in that group and in other parts of the kind of administrative services for research and other kind of operational side of things, whether they're in my organization or other parts of the university, is we can't do our research if we can't do it safely, if we can't manage our funding, if we can't hire the people that we want to hire. All of these different aspects of the facilities and the operations of the lab are absolutely essential to being able to do the outstanding research. And I hope that, and I think this is something that you have helped instill across the lab, is that it is, in some sense, a very big, broad team science project, which is that that all of the people in operations should feel part of the science breakthroughs that happen, as we should all feel an appreciation for the people on the operations side. I should also say that I'm not completely up to date on all of the operations activities at the lab, and so one of the first things I will do is talk with Michael about what are the top priorities that he has, what are the big things that he is concerned about, what keeps him up at night, and similarly talking to other people across the lab.
As you know, a big part of this job is overcoming barriers to success in research. So how do you think about how you'll be overcoming those barriers and challenges that the lab will be facing in the future?
Well, I think that, I will think about the stewardship of the people at the lab very broadly, and managing and attracting the best talent, and helping to tell the story of Berkeley Lab to stakeholder groups, whether it's Department of Energy, others in Washington, and the broader community. I think that I will say, growing up in the Midwest, I didn't know anything about Berkeley Lab or actually any of the national labs, and so how we make sure that people understand the value of the labs to the universities across the country, I think is something that we can do a better job of, and so that's something that I would hope that we can help to really elevate that in the national discussion. So there's a lot of challenges that we're all facing right now in the research community, and some of them are coming from the same things that are giving us opportunities, such as AI, and thinking about what it means to our disciplines. I'll just mention a couple of anecdotes. I was at a review at another lab several months ago and went to a session where we had junior researchers talking about AI and quantum, and there were posters and things like that. And I walked away from that session thinking, I either need to retire or I need to learn a lot more about this stuff. And that is, I think, very threatening to people, that these things are changing so rapidly that it can be hard to figure out what is it that I need to learn as a senior researcher in a discipline. And we were having a faculty hiring discussion in my department on campus, and the kinds of questions that came up were, do we believe this field of research is going to exist in a year? Do we feel that we can hire anybody who is not using AI in order to advance their particular discipline? That was really quite alarming to me, but also I think it reflects what the whole field is facing, which is, if I can write 50 papers in a year, and they're high quality papers that are going to get accepted into top conferences or journals in my field, like, what does this mean about the field and how it's going to change and how we evaluate success and impact and things like that? Maybe we'll stop writing quite so many papers. I don't know, we'll see.
So is there anything you'd like our community to know as you come into this job?
Well, first of all, I am very excited about the future of the lab, and I think the opportunities that we are going to face, and with including things like AI, but also just all the amazing science problems. I will say, one of the things people ask me what I most like about my job as Vice Chancellor for Research at UC Berkeley, and absolutely it is going around the campus and talking to people about their research, because everybody is excited about their research, and I know that is also the case here at the lab. So I'm very much looking forward to learning more about some parts of the lab that I'm less familiar with, and hearing about the big science questions they're addressing and the breakthroughs that they have had. So I think that's probably the main thing I want people to know. I also just want to recognize that it is a challenging time, and I know that people that I've worked with at this laboratory for many years, some of them are no longer here at the lab, and that is difficult. It's been difficult for me, and some of the changes that have been made in priorities and in funding and things like that have really impacted people. So I am not trying to ignore the challenges that people face, but I really hope that we can all work together to also take advantage of the opportunities and move the lab forward so it continues to be really successful in delivering science.